fine, whatever, or we can come up with a new thing. Starting here, or?
We'll start here. You can, I think it's easier to sit here.
Welcome.
So we'll just I'll just hold on with welcome and then we will go this say a few words.
Carlos, just bring to your attention that when you speak, everybody in the room can hear you. And Maria Cristina will give you the go when we are ready to start. We are still waiting for Elizabeth and for people to join the room.
I'll leave that for Elizabeth.
You want to see him big when he speaks, huh? So I will remove the presentation. When he speaks, I will remove the presentation.
Yeah, we'll put him in.
We have a few speakers online. Can you just say that we are waiting for the...
Good morning, good afternoon. We're just waiting for a few others to join the meeting, the side event, sorry, and they're coming from the plenary. So you give us a few minutes. We're also waiting for Elizabeth to join us. Thank you very much.
We have attendees, so... Even on a summer.
Just for those here in the room, just to know that this is a hybrid event, so we have a few other participants online. So thank you very much.
Don't be shy, come in. Elizabeth is here. Where's that? No, maybe
No, we lost the level.
No, he's there. He's outside.
Hello.
Elizabeth, how are you?
Fine.
Good to see you.
Yes.
How are you doing? Well coordinated.
Breathing.
We have Carlos online.
Huh?
We have Carlos online.
Ah,
He's
okay.
joining from Bali.
Bali.
Yeah.
And they finished. They finished yesterday or
They
today.
finished yesterday, yes, and but he's now at a regional preparatory meeting for our course.
Oh. The work continues.
Yes, it doesn't stop.
Will Monica be able to join?
Monica, unfortunately, will not be able to join us because she's traveling today. So she's on a
yeah.
plane, and so are the rest of the colleagues from the Minamata Secretariat.
They are all traveling. They good folk. I've not checked ISD today. Even yesterday.
Check the details, yes.
Should I ask Nabil to come in and then we start?
Yeah.
We have a few people online, Elizabeth. People very motivated to follow you on a Sunday.
morning, good afternoon to everyone, and good afternoon to those here in Geneva, as well as those that are joining us online for this event. This event on chemicals, waste, and biodiversity has been co-organized by the Secretariats of the Biodiversity, the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, and the Secretariat of the Minamata Convention, with the collaboration also of the Geneva Environment Network. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll introduce myself. I'm Maria Cristina Cárdenas. I'm a Senior Policy and Strategy Advisor in the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. And I take this opportunity also to apologize on behalf of the Secretariat of the Minamata Convention. They will not be able to join us today because of some logistic issues. They're actually on the plane traveling back to Geneva from their COP in Bali. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists and participants today. I have here Elizabeth Merema, the Executive Secretary of the Biodiversity Convention, who you all know very well. Next to her, I have Mr. Neville Ash from UNEP CMCW. I always get it wrong. Yeah.
I'll explain it.
Okay, thank you. And online, we have Mr. Carlos Martín Novella, the Deputy Secretary of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. Thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor to Elizabeth.
Good afternoon, all. Those of us here at the venue. Greetings to those who have been able to join us virtually. Carlos, good also to see you online. Yes, we are here in Geneva, which is a major hub of the global governance of chemicals and waste, with their presence here with the 3 secretariats and adding the Mercury or Minamata Secretariat, together with a strategic approach to international chemical management, SAICM. Thanks also to our Geneva Environment Network and other entities, and all these are really working on pollution-related matters. Here in Geneva, I don't need to explain that we are meeting for the last 2 weeks and the remaining few days under the umbrella of the Convention on Biological Diversity with our 2 subsidiary bodies and the working group, where negotiations for the hopefully transformative, ambitious, realistic Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework continuing to take place. In addition, you may recall recently we had also a decision from the UN Environment Assembly for the initiation of the international intergovernmental negotiation for the new multilateral treaty on plastic waste. And probably one might wonder, biodiversity, where does it come from, plastic waste? But very important, and that's the essence of this joint event here. So the development and adoption of this overarching framework come actually at a time in history when we are facing these multiple crises of climate change, biodiversity, pollution, and health. And at a time when it has become imperative for the world community to come together to take necessary changes to ensure well-being of the people and the planet, both for the current and future generations. So our conventions need to be part of this movement for transformative change and further explore potentials for synergies and cooperation. And our conventions need to continue to explore these complex interlinkages and commonalities between chemicals, waste, and biodiversity. Among other sustainable development goals, if we look at SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production, is an important goal which again brings all of our conventions together. The use of chemicals is growing due to the population growth, increasing consumption, and the trend is is actually likely to continue. But hazardous waste and other pollutants also, especially those which continue to be released into the atmosphere in large quantities in the environment, have its own effect. And ecosystems are equally affected by these pollutants, and the capacity of ecosystems to provide services to humans getting compromised. The IPBES report, or Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, identified pollution as one of the direct drivers of biodiversity loss. And the same report also considered that waste, through its impact on air and water quality, has negative impacts on well-being, especially the poor and the vulnerable groups. So Maria, with us here, thank you very much, from the Chemicals Secretariat, will give us some insights on the interlinkages between biodiversity, chemicals, and waste, particularly from the recent study published by UNEP and BRS, the chemicals, together with the Minamata Secretariat. In addition, we'll hear from Neville, from the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center, on the recent study again on the consultation on strengthening collaboration and coordination among the chemicals and waste conventions, as well as biodiversity related conventions, which was sponsored by the Nordic Council of Ministers. So I hope these two studies will really prove to us that how cooperation and synergies among our different conventions is inevitable. And then, of course, we have ourselves, for instance, and all the conventions have participated in the two Bern conventions, Bern 1, Bern 2 consultative workshops on biodiversity-related conventions on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And you have also participated in an expert workshop for multilateral conventions and cycling. And all this collaboration with UNEP in the development of this study for potential cooperation and synergies between biodiversity and chemicals and waste convention will be also presented by Neville in few moments. We all know the global efforts to enhance cooperation won't be enough. So cooperation must be strengthened, not just at the global level, at the level of the secretariats, but also at the regional and national levels on the implementation of these different conventions on the ground, and where chemicals and waste are managed, and where the impacts of biodiversity and ecosystems are being felt, particularly for the vulnerable populations. We are pleased and very happy that I have my colleagues here with us. And of course, all the conventions also had an opportunity to meet the co-chairs sometime April last year at the invitation by UNEP, again to discuss and enhance this alignment of our convention priorities together with the Post-2020 framework. So probably I should not take much time, otherwise there's a lot to discuss, and let me give Maria then an opportunity to take us through. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Elizabeth, very much for those words and for introducing our event. Before I take the floor to present our report, I would like to invite Mr. Carlos Martin Novella, our Deputy Executive Secretary of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions, to say also a few words. Thank you. Carlos, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Maria Cristina. Thank you very much, Maria Cristina. And good evening from Bali. I'm attending the regional preparatory meeting for Asia Pacific for our COP that will take place in Geneva. Just after the celebration of the fourth conference of the parties of the Minamata Convention that I finished just about 44 hours ago, very successful meeting.
Sorry, Carlos, to interrupt you.
Very much.
We're having problem showing your video.
Okay, you are missing my face, so not so important. You can share it, you know.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
Maybe you are shy.
So, as I said, well, I can try to change let's try to change the virtual background and not to put virtual background anymore. Maybe that this is better or not.
Just continue.
Just go ahead, Carlos.
Okay. Okay, I go ahead. So, as I said, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for the CBD to join the Minamata Convention Secretariat and the BRI Secretariat in organizing this event, and also the Geneva Environment Network for helping on the logistics for organizing the event. As you well said, Elizabeth, and it's well known since many years ago, pollution is among the main causes of biodiversity loss. And we believe that the very specific MEAs dealing with chemicals and waste, we have an important role to play. I will try to explain you what is the role that the Stockholm, Rotterdam and Basel Conventions, taking the reverse order that we usually do, can play. Starting with Stockholm. The Stockholm Convention deals with persistent organic pollutants. Those are pesticides, but also industrial chemicals. The industrial chemicals also have important impacts on biodiversity, not only the pesticides. For example, anything that relates to endocrine disruptors, dioxins, furans, etc., are as bad, if not worse, than many pesticides. And the Convention explicitly addresses these persistent organic pollutants for the impacts on health and environment. And when I talk about environment, the criteria that we use to evaluate the impacts of those chemicals and pesticides are based on biodiversity. When any of those products are coming on our table, they may, after some assessments that take some time, they may be listed in the annexes of our convention. Being listed under the annexes of the Stockholm Convention means that the production of those chemicals is banned, the commercialization and use of those chemicals is banned as well, and it is necessary the destruction of all the milestones. So if you from the CBD have a problem with pollution, please be very specific. Tell us exactly what is the chemical that is causing your problems, and then will be a chance that will come into the screening of the Stockholm Convention if this is a proposal supported by any party. And the final end is very, very concrete. As I said, it's banning production, it's banning commercialization and use, and it's destruction of the milestocks. In addition, we have a compliance mechanism, and we have a scientific body that, applying biodiversity criteria, analyzes if those chemicals deserve to be listed. Finally, the Convention has what we call the Global Monitoring Program, assessing what are the remains of those chemicals on the environment, using different media, water, air, soils, also having samples on wildlife, and also having samples on human fluids. So it's a comprehensive system that is going for many years, this long historic series, and I think would be extremely useful for the biodiversity framework to be able to assess and to use as indicators in this context. There is the other convention, the Rotterdam Convention. It is the Informed Consent Convention. This convention applies not only to persistent organic pollutants, but to any chemical. And when one chemical is banned for whatever reason in two countries, at least two countries, in two different regions, may come into this annex of the Rotterdam Convention, and as a consequence there is an obligation for prior informed consent for any transboundary movement of these chemicals. So extremely useful if any country again identifies that one chemical is causing damage on biodiversity, to trigger this process of prior informed consent. But once again, what we need is not just you to tell us that pollution is a problem, we need to know exactly what is the chemical, what is the formulation that we need to consider. And finally, the Basel Convention addresses waste. and addresses different levels in the life cycle of the products when they become waste. In first instance, it regulates the transboundary movements of waste. Secondly, produces guidelines on sustainable management of waste streams. And finally, is able to look at the aspects related to the prevention of waste. To give you an example of the relevance of this for biodiversity, I can mention, for example, what we have done with plastics recently. Unfortunately, for historic reasons, the plastics were not included in the annexes of the Basel Convention until our last conference of the parties, when some plastic types became included into the annex of the Basel Convention. As a consequence, now there is a strong regulatory framework to identify those plastics when they are going across borders. We are working in collaboration with the World Customs Organizations and also with Interpol. So it's very specific. These types of plastics require specific authorization permits to be transported across borders, and some of them are even banned to be transported across borders. And finally, with the guidance that we are now submitting to our Conference of the Parties, there are very specific methodologies to be used domestically for treated plastics in order to prevent them to create damage on environment. So with these few words, I would finalize saying that you have at your disposal 3, and together with Minamata, 4 extremely powerful instruments. We are not framework conventions, we are executive conventions. We list and we take out of the market basically and from use chemicals, and the only thing that we need is to have very precise information. Unfortunately, I'm part of the guild. These conventions has been, in my point of view, largely ignored by the CBD historically, and I think that at this stage we should do something about that. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you very much, Carlos, for those words. And I will just now proceed talking a bit about the report that was prepared jointly by the secretariats of the Basel, Rotterdam, Minamata, and Stockholm Conventions. It is called the Interlinkages between the Chemicals and Waste Multilateral Agreements and Biodiversity, the Key Insights. This report is actually available online, should you wish to have a look at it. As Elizabeth mentioned earlier on, pollution is one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss. Chemicals and waste are ubiquitous in the environment. They're found everywhere, all around the globe. They're invisible, yet they're parts of our daily lives. We find them at home, in the environment. We cannot get rid of them. We need them. And as Elizabeth also mentioned, the sound management of chemicals and waste is an enabler to many of the SDGs, starting with SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production. Of the 196 targets and the 30 indicators under the SDGs, around 69 targets and 91 related indicators have been cited to be relevant to chemicals and waste. So that's quite a bit. And this links together to the point that Elizabeth made earlier about the previous report, which referenced this particular target. You heard a bit from Carlos as to what the conventions on ecosystems and biota and at all levels of the food chain, and also affect human nature contributions to people. The effects of POPs on the environment have also been observed in a range of ecosystems. POPs are having effects in freshwater ecosystems such as lakes and rivers, the latter often contributing POPs to coastal marine environments. Mangroves, for instance, have been shown to contain a suite of chemicals, including POPs, resulting in impacts both on the diversity and the plants and animals and the biota. They affect the ecosystem structure, and as vulnerable populations decline as a result of the exposure of chemicals and pollutants. The accumulation of POPs in marine mammals, such as Baltic seals, bottlenose and striped dolphins and killer whales, is associated with population declines. As you know, PCBs are actually listed for elimination under the Stockholm Convention. The levels of PCB remain a significant exposure concern for many aquatic biota, including polar bears, killer whales, pilot whales, seals, and various other seabirds, shorebirds, and birds of prey. The levels of these chemicals put the species at a higher risk of immune and reproductive and/or carcinogenic effects. PCBs mediated effects on reproduction and immune function may threaten the long-term viability of over 50% of the world killer whale populations. So that's of a big concern. Pesticides, which are listed both under the Stockholm Convention and the Rotterdam Convention, have been documented to threaten bird life, with bird populations having declined 20 to 25% since pre-agricultural times, with one of the major causes being pesticides. Pesticide poisoning is currently the greatest threat to the Andean condor and the bald eagle populations in the US that have declined in part because of exposure to DDT. Here, I want to note that DDT is actually another one of those chemicals that is listed for elimination under the Stockholm Convention. Pesticide poisoning is also, by affecting insects and pollinators, pesticides may also impact a wide range of other ecosystem services. For example, while animal pollination directly affects the yield and quality of about 75% of the global food crop types, pollinators are important beyond agriculture and food production, as their habitats provide ecological, cultural, financial, health, human, and social values. The declines in pollinators diversity are expected to continue globally, with adverse effects on pollinators having direct effects on agricultural yields and food supplies. Currently, 16.5% of vertebrate pollinators are threatened with global extinction, raising to 30% for island species. So I hope that this nice picture sort of makes you realize that behind the nice picture, chemicals are threatening their existence. Today, humans extract more from the earth and produce more waste than ever before. The best estimate of the global amount of municipal solid waste is around 2.1 billion tons per year, with at least 33% of that amount not managed in an environmentally sound manner. As the proportion of discarded chemically intensive products increase, municipal waste are becoming hazardous waste. I should point out here also that waste are covered under the Basel Convention. electrical and electronic waste, the e-waste sector, is one of the greatest growing waste streams due to consumer demand, perceived and planned obsolescence, and rapid changes in technology, among other things. You all, I'm sure, have a phone, a computer, a tablet, and they're very nice while you have them and you're using them, but soon they'll be disposed and they'll end up in a place like this one. In 2019, for instance, it was estimated that 53.6 million metric tons were generated globally, up to 9.2 metric tons since 2014. And this is expected to grow up to 74 million metric tons by 2030. So it is quite daunting. Mercury, covered by the Minamata Convention, is highly toxic and a heavy metal. It is transported also around the globe through the environment. So its emissions and releases also affect human health, the environment, and including very remote areas. Something similar to the Stockholm Convention. Mercury is transported around the globe and through the environment, so its emissions and releases can affect human health and the environment, even in remote locations. As you see, artisanal and small-scale gold mining contribute highly to this. Plastics, which were mentioned earlier by Elizabeth, they're another issue of great concern. They are not only ubiquitous to the aquatic atmosphere and terrestrial ecosystems, but also to to human health. The global plastic production was 359 million tons in 2018, and is expected to double by 2050. So unless we do something, we will continue to see images like this one. And with COVID, of course, the increase of waste has been notable. You can't say no to wearing a mask. Well, everyone here, except for me at this moment, is wearing a mask, and it will soon become a waste. And what can we do about it? We need to protect ourselves too. So we need to find a solution that is suitable both for the environment, for health, and for knowing what to do with plastics. Marine microplastics are also quite important. They're made, many of them, of chemicals, including POPs. They also accumulate contaminants like POPs and can transport them long range. So once plastics degrade in the environment, in the marine environment, for instance, they're still there. You don't see them, but they still have an effect. Micro and microplastics can also transport invasive alien species, including harmful algal blooms, pathogens, and non-native species, with at least 300 species known to disperse by rafting on debris, which can form a new habitat. So again, another nice link, I would say. So what are the conclusions that this report brought out? One, well, it has several conclusions, and I won't go through all of them, but just to mention a few. That global food security is under threat due to the threats posed by pesticides, that there's a need for a reduction in nature's exposure to pesticides, that there's a need to promote environmentally sound management of chemicals and wastes, that, for instance, agricultural runoffs, including pesticides, are a major source of water pollution and contaminants of underground aquifers. And one extra recommendation or highlight that this report also brings is the fact that climate change is a key factor in amplifying the effects of chemicals, but is also expected to contribute to the continued revolatilization of both mercury and POPs. So these are issues that we need to take care of and be aware of. Now, as Carlos mentioned earlier, the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions address some of the most significant chemicals and waste pollution that has been identified in the last several decades, and they do contribute to the conservation of and sustainable use of biological diversity. The three conventions together aim at protecting human health and the environment. The Minamata Convention, on the other hand, takes the life cycle approach to protect human health and the environment from mercury. Should you wish to learn a bit more of what our conventions do, you can just follow the links. And I should have said that at the end of this side event, we will be sharing the recording, so you will have copies of the slides as well as the information. So thank you. And I guess that now...
Thank you very much. I hope this is not a scaring, threatening report, but let's hear from Neville.
Thank you very much, Maria and Elizabeth and Carlos, for your opening remarks as well. And I'm keen to learn from you on your PowerPoint presentation skills as well. It's fantastic at the end, there's a bird fluttered away. It's also brilliant to hear from the BRS Secretariat on a technical presentation on biodiversity, and lots of interesting information coming through there from our colleagues in the BRS Secretariat on biodiversity. So I'm going to pick up a little bit on what's been said so far and talk about some of the implications of the understanding we have around the links between the biodiversity and chemicals and waste agendas, about what that might mean in practice for strengthening collaboration and coordination between the MEAs. So I think I'm pressing slides here, and brilliant, thank you. So over the last year and a bit, there's been some work that's been done, as Elizabeth mentioned, with the Nordic Council of Ministers, where at UNEP WCMC we worked with partners to put together a series of information, including on the report that Maria has mentioned, and many others. We worked closely with colleagues across the MEA secretariats and with parties, and convened an expert workshop to bring information together with some oversight, and much of that is focused, in the next slide, on considering what, because of the information available, the understanding and the experiences that governments and others have, what are the options for strengthening collaboration and coordination between the biodiversity and chemicals and waste clusters. So there are a range of areas addressed by the report, but the last one in this list is definitely the most important. So looking at the information base around pollution as a driver of biodiversity loss, we've heard a lot about that already. Looking at the extent already to which there's been an international response to the impacts of pollution, and including in that the alignment of the policy response across the biodiversity and chemical clusters. Of course, importantly, this is all implemented at the national and often very local levels, so we looked at that. And the particular opportunity at the moment with the ongoing discussions here, of course, on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Agenda and the Post-2020 Agenda for Chemicals and Waste. The most important one is that last bullet as well, which I'll come to. I should have said the website you've seen there is quite a long one, but I'm sure if you just Google the title, that might be a quicker way to get to the report online. So we recognise a number of areas where there are, and these came out through the report, but particularly in the workshop discussions, a strong interest, mutual interest between the biodiversity and the chemicals and waste clusters. And these include some obvious ones, like understanding the impacts of chemicals and waste on biodiversity. We've heard a lot about that already. Understanding the pathways by which chemicals and waste move through the environment, and understanding the implications of those pathways for potential impacts known and possibly unknown on biodiversity as well. Understanding the consequences of these impacts, social, financial, as well as environmental. And then, of course, the shared interest in understanding opportunities to reduce the risk on biodiversity and from biodiversity change, of course, as well on human health. Key interest in working together and understanding more about how there might be better, more integrated approaches across biodiversity and chemicals and waste communities to have and ensure cooperative action, develop responses, and then this penultimate bullet here, which is interesting but not often talked about, the role of biodiversity through nature-based solutions, of course, in addressing some of the challenges faced by pollution. For example, the use of trees in urban areas to improve air quality, the use of wetlands to improve and address organic waste as well. And then we recognise there's a number of international initiatives already underway, and so we're building, not starting from scratch. There are, in the next slide, many lessons which have been learned from the wider cooperation synergies agenda as well, which are important to take into account as we think about the options for strengthening between biodiversity and chemicals and waste. And the most important of these are that whatever actions are taken, they are focused on strengthening implementation. So they're not theoretical, they're practical ways in which we can strengthen the achievement of the two agendas together. The importance of national level action. So yes, international synergies and cooperation important, but it also needs to, and particularly needs to, work at the national level with international support where helpful. Pragmatic, practical approaches, let me come on to that shortly, recognising the importance of common issues and joint agendas, and importantly, respecting the autonomy of the different MEAs, different parties that they have, the different mandates that they have, and how they can be brought to work together, respecting those different political realities. So there are 4 areas in which there are a series of actions which came through from these various discussions, very practical discussions we had at the workshop, and these are the 4 areas, and I'll quickly go through them one by one in subsequent slides. Strengthening implementation, working together to achieve common aims, the kinds of services, processes under the different conventions that might be better connected to support this work, and then what are those key entry points internationally to put these actions into place. So, some of these are really, really simple and very, very obvious, and in some countries, of course, are happening reasonably well, but not everywhere on everything. So plenty of opportunity to think here about where there might be gaps that can be filled. So for example, ensuring that national focal points of the various MEAs know each other and have a chance to work together. Again, very, very practical steps. A number of examples we've seen over the last decade, particularly in relation to the Aichi biodiversity target, which of course included a target on pollution. But in many parties, jointly to the various conventions, they weren't aware that there was, in the case of focal points for the chemical and waste cluster, they weren't aware that there was a pollution target which had been agreed under the Biodiversity Convention, and our biodiversity colleagues hadn't necessarily reached out to chemical and waste cluster focal points in the negotiation of that target. I think we're doing a slightly better job as we go into the post-2020 agenda, but still possibly opportunities to do more. So national focal point coordination. True also of competent national authorities responsible for managing chemicals and waste, for managing biodiversity, and the opportunity to strengthen through councils, networks, formal or informal processes at the national level, the coordination and information sharing at the national level. And that might be taken a step further to think about how there might be more integrated planning processes in place. National chemical action plans, of course, national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and the opportunity to better link those through the planning processes at the national level. And then at the international level, what might be in place to support that, and it might be things like COP decisions, recognising the importance of joint planning, simple elements of text that might be included into COP decisions, for example, to support that process. A number of areas that came through where there are, again, important opportunities to strengthen cooperation and collaboration on communications, for example. Both the chemicals and waste and the biodiversity cluster struggle with communications, and the importance of our dependencies on chemicals, as we've heard, our dependency on biodiversity, and yet, of course, the risks and threats that they can face, biodiversity and people and the environment from chemicals. The planning I've mentioned already, but particularly here focused on risk, understanding risk, and looking at the opportunities for strengthening governance to better and more jointly understand risk and plan to mitigate it. Research, we've heard already about some of the information available, but huge opportunities, and as Carlos was saying earlier, they need to be very specific in understanding the specifics of chemical impacts on biodiversity and how that can feed back into the policy process. So sharing research and putting all this into practice through joint collaborative projects. What are the projects that can be put into place, co-designed, co-developed, co-fundraised for, and co-delivered between the different cluster entities. If we move on to the next one here, these are the kinds of processes that might be interesting to think about. We talk about synergies and reporting across the biodiversity cluster of conventions. Well, what about broadening that discussion to include, of course, the chemical and waste clusters as well? What are the opportunities to support capacity development across all the conventions beyond biodiversity, beyond the chemical and waste themselves, working together there? Again, sharing of information, critical, very tangible, practical steps. Science policy interface, of course, with the recent UNEA decision, huge opportunity to strengthen the connections, the lessons learned and the experiences in joint work, potentially in the future as well, of a strengthened science policy platform on chemical and waste, and with IPBES. That would be true internationally and certainly at the national level too. And then the last of these 4 points was where might this come into practice, where might these opportunities be at the international level for these entry points for strengthening coordination and collaboration. Of course, we've mentioned the post-2020 processes, and both of those and the interaction between them could be important, including, for example, the use of joint indicators under the monitoring framework that is to be determined. We mentioned UNEA already, both in relation to the recent UNEA, but future UNEAs. The role they might be there bringing together the pollution and the nature pillars under the UNEA discourse. Internationally important, also regionally, that might be through regional conventions, it might be through regional ministerial environmental fora, and other opportunities again to bring together these agendas and think about further alignment. It's certainly the case through international finance institutions, the GEF and others, which are financing biodiversity and chemical and waste initiatives, to think about where there might be again stronger connections, multifocal area kind of projects and incentives for doing that. And then other agendas where there is clearly an opportunity to bring the joint concerns and interests from the biodiversity and chemical and waste cluster to bear. And One Health would be an example of that, the agricultural agenda and others. So that just leads me back to remind you that this report is available. It's been out for about a month now. We developed this, as I mentioned, in close coordination with many, including with review and input from the various MEA secretariats across the biodiversity and chemical and waste cluster. So with that, I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neville, for that very good presentation. And just for those that are interested in the report, it is available on the website for this event. So you can download it directly from there, as well as the report that was produced by the PRS and Minamata secretariats. They're all there. So you can find everything in one place. And talking about one place, I think that this is a very important opportunity for us to be able to come together and see how we can ensure that we break the silos between, or the artificial silos that exist between the chemicals and waste and the biodiversity worlds. You know, most of the structures that we have in place are very similar. Some of the participants are similar. I've seen quite a few familiar faces as I walk around the venue today. So, you know, I do know that quite a lot of people work on these issues. And for us, what's important is what can we do to continue this work? I think that Neville mentioned some nice points, some of the things that are already going on, and some of the easy things that we can do. And I would just open the floor now for questions or comments on what you think could be sort of really achievable actions that you can take.
Maybe if I can say a few words before. Let me just add a few words in terms of specifically from the Convention on Biological Diversity, and especially what is happening here, again to show that linkages between biodiversity and chemicals. For instance, we know the Subsidiary Body on Implementation has been meeting, and its part of its discussion contributes to the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And specifically, draft target 7 is on reducing pollution from all sources to levels that are not harmful to biodiversity and ecosystem functions and human health. So clearly, when the framework is adopted, and hopefully this target will remain or even made stronger, means then we have an opening both at international level and national level to work on this common issue of pollution, which is a direct primary driver for biodiversity loss. If we look at our joint, our CBD program of work on marine and coastal biodiversity, which, as you recall, even from the plenary, was rather strong statements had been made, but underlining the importance of this subject. It also contributes to preventing and mitigating adverse impacts of plastic waste on biodiversity, and hope this then can play even a major role in terms of supporting countries to continue to tackle plastic waste. And now, as the new convention or treaty will be negotiated, and hopefully then that contribution of bringing the different clusters together will be part of that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, also for updating us with what's been happening here, and those are for sure very welcome words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and also for these really interesting presentations. So I'm Ingrid Seer, and I represent ICLEI. We work with local and subnational governments, and we've also been very involved in the CBD process to get a renewed plan of action for subnational and local governments. And one of the things, and I'm glad, I think, Marina, you mentioned that, what is it that we can do together? One of the things that we have done, and we've just recently, well, in fact, yesterday just launched what we call our commitment platform, which is linked to the 2030 action targets. And it essentially provides a mechanism and a vehicle where subnational governments and cities can make commitments, including on Target 7. As we know, specifically municipalities have a big role to play insofar as waste management is concerned. And we would very much like to collaborate with yourselves on this, and how we can, one of the things that we need very often at the lower levels of government is not just capacity building, but very specifically also practical guides. And that is the sort of thing that we have a provision on this platform for practical guidance, best practices, etc. So we would very much like to talk to you further around how we can strengthen that collaboration, particularly insofar as the planning and implementation side of things is concerned.
Thank you very much for that. And if I may just very quickly respond also, under the Basel Convention, we have the partnership on the household waste.
Yes.
So that, that would be great for you to link up with it. Thank you.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I work in the Japanese government in charge of pesticide management and registration. And in the work, it is quite difficult because I understand what you in the presentation. On the other hand, if we reduce the use of pesticides, the food production may reduce as well. Then hunger will increase. It is another issue. So we need to consider very carefully. And it is in that case, I think the role of science is really, really important. So if it is scientifically justified, we have to go in the direction. But if it is not the case, maybe we have to think. Otherwise, we will perish other side of the problem. We will make the other side of the problem. This is my observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Nero.
Well, maybe, I think that's a really important point, and maybe I'll quickly respond, because of course we also want to advance the scientific knowledge, and so there's, with that is an important, I think, assurance that there is going to be investment in the science to understand the experimentation, to understand how reduced pesticides, how various forms of integrated pest management might support continued food production, resilience in agricultural systems, and avoid the problems
Yeah.
that you're suggesting might come from the result of changes in the use of chemicals. So science-based, but always, of course, researching and experimenting to determine opportunities to bring these win-win outcomes for biodiversity and, in this case, food security. And that requires certainly continuing to fill that knowledge gap as well, because, of course, we have to do both. We have to continue to produce food, and we have to conserve biodiversity. So that's the research challenge we find ourselves in, identifying the best, most cost-effective, scalable, locally context-specific ways to deliver on that challenge.
I understand. Unfortunately, we don't know everything. Science doesn't know everything, and especially for biodiversity, there are so many kinds of uncertainty in the world. So we need more research. We need more scientific knowledge. But at this moment, maybe we should manage or regulate pesticides or other chemicals based on current best science. This is my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Two. We have one.
Thank you very much. I'm Stephen Mouba, Director General of Environment and Nature Protection of Gabon, and I'm very glad to join this very important and interesting discussion, and I commend all the interveners. I have maybe two practical questions. One is, we have those different issues to deal with, and sometimes we're in a context for countries in a very practical way, where it's finally very difficult to prioritize. We have to face climate change, we have to face biodiversity issues, we have to face chemicals issues. So how can this work and all those reports together can help us to find a way to better prioritize in one hand, and also in the other hand to have a very efficient actions on the ground? Because if we can see that in terms of governance there is some link to create to better manage those issues in terms of ecosystems, it's one thing. It's only one thing. When we have to deal, for instance, with Minamata issues, with mercury issues, it's a very complicated and long process where we can see with gold mining activities, with fisheries activities, we go to health issues. So it's very difficult sometimes to prioritize and to choose where we have to put our efforts when we don't have all the required capacities in terms of technical person, in terms of technical guidance. And the second point I wanted to raise, it's also how can you help us to have the good data and the good framework, because it's a huge challenge in terms of organization, but to set up this organization, to have the good policies, we have to get the good data. And in a poor data environment, it's very complicated to really frame the way we have to deal with those issues and to organize it. And so how can we make this a very close link, help us practically on the ground to deal with those issues? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And can I invite one of the speakers to perhaps address, I don't know whether you, Neville, or Carlos, do you want to have a go?
Maybe, Maria Cristina, if you wanted to elaborate a bit on this question, very interesting about the priority setting. Of course, there is a challenge for all member states, and it's very linked to the resources, of course. And in this context, it's very interesting to see how, in the context of the discussions on the replenishment of the GF that are taking place now and going to conclude in a few weeks' time, the new GF is going to have an structure with an axis that is the traditional focal areas, and then is the new impact programs. These impact programs, that is where the majority of the money of the GF is going to come, are being designed exactly in the way to try to find co-benefits between different focal areas. So it's not as much as presenting an individual project on biodiversity or an individual project on climate change or an individual project on chemicals and waste. Would be rather those programs that integrate on a same physical space, all the different aspects and priorities of biodiversity, chemicals and waste, climate change, that will have access to this money on the impact programs of the GF. So I think we are very excited with that. It will give an enormous opportunity for the different conventions to work together with national authorities on the ground and also implementing agencies, and to see how what we are now discussing, how to obtain co-benefits in the implementation of the chemicals and waste conventions and the biodiversity and the climate change conventions, can move from being a theoretical discussion to a very practical exercise with direct funding from the GF. Thank you.
And maybe just quickly to build on that, and let me come back to the GF, because I think there are some additional opportunities there as well. But just in terms of very practical steps, so as a focal point or engaged in negotiations here, it would be entirely reasonable to be heading home next week, and after catching up on some sleep, then to be reaching out to colleagues across other MEAs and dropping a note to focal points from other conventions across the biodiversity and the chemical and waste cluster. Just come back from a meeting in Geneva, we've been discussing a pollution target, we'd be really keen to meet and discuss this with you. But then I think the important point is leveraging that opportunity to respond to your question more, which is around how then all focal points can come together with a set of priorities, compare those lists and think about where the overlapping areas are. And it may be that a particular issue is rising up the list of many different focal points, challenges being faced, maybe it's capacity for monitoring issues. That links me back to the GEF, because the GEF Early Action Grants, announced at the first part of the COP15 in Kunming, will be supporting parties, amongst other things, to think about the sufficiency of national monitoring systems. And maybe in those discussions it's helpful to bring in colleagues from across the chemical and waste cluster to think about where there might be efficiencies again in establishing and strengthening national monitoring systems. Water quality might be a good, interesting example of that, very directly relevant to the chemical waste and the biodiversity agenda. So those are very practical steps that could be taken, but I think a lot of this starts with convening, sharing information, with sitting around the same table with focal points and, say, representatives from competent authorities at the national level to have those discussions, identify the joint priorities, the joint challenges, and how that can then feed up with a collective voice into the various MEAs which can support taking action.
You wanted to speak? I thought you wanted to respond, part of the response, the CBD colleague.
Okay, so.
Thanks very much. I should have perhaps been more clear. Just a very small point to add to that. I mean, as noted by Carlos and Neville, under the GEF8 replenishment negotiation, there's going to be a very much enhanced country support program, which is designed to assist countries in this issue of helping to prioritize and develop integrated approaches and communication across the conventions for which GEF serves as the financial mechanism. So GEF8 will be kicking off in the 1st of July. Obviously there will be a rollout of this program, but we really do hope that the enhanced country support program and the national dialogues will support you in this process. So that would be a practical opportunity of helping to operationalise the ideas that Neville was talking about. And then perhaps just a final comment on the issue of the importance of science in this, and just a thought that FAO has been one of the strongest specialised agencies in the United Nations system in mainstreaming biodiversity in a genuine and practical manner within its programmes. And so I think opportunities exist, working with and through FAO. And then, of course, the thinking towards the establishment of a science policy platform under the chemicals BRS conventions, I think, is also relevant to that. And I'm thinking also of the collaboration that we've been trying to stimulate across IPBES, for example, and the International Panel on Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And related to that, also the opportunities for, and this is something I think we all need to collaboratively look into, the opportunities to make use of the Intergovernmental Resource Panel on Sustainable Consumption and Production. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. And just to add one thing now that you mentioned the FAO, the Rotterdam Convention has its secretariat serviced both by UNEP and FAO. So that's a nice entry point. I think we have someone else asking for the floor too.
Thank you. So my name is Citlali Gonzalez, and I work in a small consultancy working on ecological transition and in Latin America. And we're putting together an economic case for biodiversity protection, and looking at examples, and trying to give, more than linking examples in every single aspect. And one aspect that we struggle to find information, and maybe you can help me out if there is some available, but I think that is missing there is making the case that is also interesting from the economic point of view, reducing chemicals, reducing waste, and therefore, the impact on biodiversity. And this is an area that could be really, explored, because we need to give examples. We need to show that from the economics perspective makes sense, to make these changes happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for raising that point. And we'll just go one at the back and then at the front.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Yasuaki from Japanese Network of United Nations Biodiversity. I have a question about the synergy between the convention. Each convention has each action programs. And also now the SAICOM is preparing the next action plan. Maybe the target might be harmonized. For example, the GBF has a target for the pollution or the waste. Maybe and also the Basel has a similar target. So maybe the harmonization will be the strengthen each convention's activity, I think. So how do you feel about it?
Thank you. I have Elizabeth here. And then perhaps Carlos.
Thank you very much, and indeed an important question. Let me take it into more of a bigger picture. We've seen here, even in the discussions of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity, NEAs have been consulted, NEA secretariats have been contributing, and actually colleagues ensuring that what is adopted or the targets, specific targets under the framework can also be implemented under their conventions. So that then once the framework is adopted, they are able to align the framework with their own policy documents, strategies, and action plan. So we hope that alignment will happen, and if it happens, then the same alignment also happens at national level. And let us remember, as Maria had said at the beginning, we are dealing with the same governments, therefore same parties, in many cases same government departments, same focal points. So we hope that the framework will not contradict other MEAs, and that's the essence of the contribution which had been opened from other MEAs. And actually the co-chairs have gone out of their way to consult these MEA secretariats to make sure that linkages is there. So we hope we'll all then continue to work together, that the parties of the other conventions will be able to align. And there are, in fact, all conventions, they can see themselves in the framework. So for the chemicals, this is where Target 7 then comes in as an entry point, but also one major decision which will be taken not just by the subsidiary body of implementation here, but by our COP virtually. Every COP is strengthened collaboration, cooperation among the MEAs. It's more or less a standing decision taken. So this is what also brings us together, and even here SBA will take that decision, which will also feed into the conference of the parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And I think Carlos would also like to say something to this point. Carlos?
Thank you, Maria Cristina. I think it's clear for everyone that Society framework, where you help to identify what are the key areas of concern, and I believe that pollution is one area of concern, of course, and then you establish bridges, establish ways of collaboration with those who can do something about it. And it's what I said. If you, perhaps I want to, it's a bit rude to say, but in many years, the CBD has been very clever and very good in pointing out that pollution and pesticides is very relevant for the laws, but I have not seen any direct action from the CBD that has prevented this to happen, basically. Because the CBD has not had the power to prevent this to happen. Those who has the power are FAO, are the BLS conventions. As I said, we can list and one can take pesticides out of the market. You cannot do it. So the only way to ensure that the future framework is successful is by establishing mechanisms and instruments to ensure the cross-fertilization and collaboration with people like us. And we are very happy to do it because in the text of our conventions, in some cases before that the CBD event was there, is the protection of environment and nature. So it's part of our mandate. Now we have to see how we optimize our efforts and how we coordinate and enhance collaboration in order to do all our efforts more efficient and more workable. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. And I think we have another request here from the floor, right?
I really appreciated this side event. It is very, very useful. I was thinking about the framework, and we should apply a methodology. So I am thinking about ecological connectivity. We need institutional connectivity. If we think about ecological corridors, we need institutional corridors at all levels. Vertical level, horizontal level, international, regional, sub-regional, national, local. And horizontal level at local level and at international level. Without this methodological approach and strategic framework, no way to achieve results. Beyond the wonderful, tremendous efforts, for example, of the Secretariat. First of all, the CBD Secretariat. It is not an issue of secretariats. It is an issue of parties. As institutionalist, I study these issues, I study behaviors, I study behavioral changes in institutions, and we know very well what is the method, the approach? The approach can be to facilitate through, for example, platforms, through guidelines to donors, facilitate some dialogue, facilitate the involvement of parties and the development of institutional arrangements in order to address these issues. Transformative change is transformative cultural change, and first of all is a transformative institutional cultural change. Change in the institutional culture.
Thank you very much. And indeed, thank you very much for highlighting the fact that we need to look for those institutional connectivities and actually to build on what we already have, to build on existing infrastructure and just make it work. Allow the different elements that already are in place to talk to each other. So, to ensure that we enhance collaboration and cooperation for a common goal, which is protecting human health and the environment. Would you like to say something?
Well, only again, just to reinforce that needs to be done very practically and tangibly. So, again, going away from this meeting, taking the draft Target 7 wording, taking it back, talking to focal points, talking to competent authorities in the chemical and waste cluster, and asking what they think of it. And if you look at the wording, even in this discussion today, we've had Elizabeth read out some of the draft wording there around reducing levels to such they're not harmful to biodiversity, and yet in the Stockholm Convention, the terminology is banning. Well, there's a big difference between banning and reducing levels to something. So that in a way, the dialogue that can happen off the back of these ongoing discussions to ensure that when COP15 Part 2 comes around, the biodiversity focal points and negotiators are there with an understanding of the interests, the opportunities from talking with their chemical and waste counterparts to further align the text, strengthen the common ambitions, the whole of government approach to what might be in the ambition for the Global Biodiversity Framework, and most importantly, how it might be operationalised and then implemented, is going to be critical. But that happens because of those very tangible steps, walking down the corridor, going across the street, talking to individuals with those other responsibilities. And then even just the slides that Maria was showing us earlier with the growth in waste by 2030. So of course, pollution is a key driver of biodiversity loss. And we know from the information we have from the chemicals and waste community around the trajectories for increased growth. And we're talking about here being nature positive by 2030. Getting rid of the drivers of biodiversity loss in the next 8 years. And yet look at the figures we have here. So there is a disconnect in the way in which information is available and used and shared, and the implications of that information for how we take forward joint. But it has to happen, as you say, very practically and tangibly, with institutions coming together, where those institutions might be individuals who are focal points for conventions, it might be the heads of competent authorities and help, but very practical, tangible steps. And wouldn't it be brilliant if every party came into COP15 Part 2, having had those conversations at the national level, and bring those conversations into bear on the negotiations? Huge opportunity to be very practical and tangible.
And I think here also a clear message we are getting, particularly at national level, is really awareness. Probably it's the awareness that these different conventions for which the same country is a party to are all connected. So we have that task of creating that awareness and educating all those who are involved at national level. Yes, there are different conventions. Yes, they have different mandates. But now we're also seeing different mandates as they are actually the same. Because if we are talking pollution here, all chemicals convention are talking pollution. Are we talking the same language? If we use the exact example which Neville has just given as an example. So let's pick these pieces and bring them together and create that needed awareness. And of course, Jeff 8 has been referred here. I think it would be really useful to see from the national level this common project, looking one project but responding to multiple issues, or really responding to multiple conventions. Actually, those might even give them more consideration than just looking at silo issues which actually cut across other conventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And indeed, we need to stop reinventing the wheel and actually making it go faster and focus on that, making it faster. I think that we're reaching the end of the time that we have been allotted for the side event. And so before giving the floor to Elizabeth to close this event, I'd just like to thank everyone who has participated here in the room and contributed questions. I don't think that we had any comments or questions online, did we? Good. Just making sure we don't forget about our online participants in this hybrid world now. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. I think my task here is easy. First, to thank my colleagues, Carlos online, Maria Cristina, Neville, and all of you for participating. And I think we leave here with one message, and imagine the timing is very right. Here we are talking of Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Chemicals are talking of the Post-2020 Sound Chemical Management. And both these processes have something in common. Can we use them as the starting point that our next decade we move from the silo implementation of different conventions into this whole of government, whole of society approach, one implementation approach, both at our level, international level, but also regional and more so national, to local, where the actual action on the ground will take place. So with this, I can only say again, thank you all of us, and thank you my dear colleagues from different conventions, that we are all going to open a new page moving forward from both the biodiversity framework but also the sound management framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, all those presentations.
How do you do that little bird flushing away?
You need to have your young generation.
PowerPoint in the options for animation, but it's effects. I think
Effects, yeah.
So it's sort of like transitions. You can do many for transition. There's lots of them. Like you get the bird. You get that little bird is really cool. They have a few others, but I like the bird. There's a plane. There's also a little plane, paper plane, but it's not as nice.
Did you say you're going to share the slides?
So you just kind of, do it as a transition from one side.
Yes, it's already on the webpage, so there. I'm going to check if on the CBD website it needs to stop here.
Thank you.
It was actually, we had an engaged audience.
Yes.
I'm very surprised,
Oh, that's
especially on a Sunday.
Everyone required to know.
I'm going to, let me just show you.
So there was quite a
No,
good audience.
I'm trying to see
And
how
The topic is important.
it's a very important topic, and Diana is going to upload this on the general site. And hopefully we'll continue to build on it as we move also
Yeah, it's
into
there.
our COPs that are coming soon.
But
I'm sure
But as you talked, I think
have you emailed
there is
me?
another
It's not
study
here,
to look at.
Ah, there we are.
I mean, this